Recently, a neighbor of mine replaced a large section of his backyard fence. And rather than let all that wood go to waste, I decided to put it into a couple other projects, the first of which being some picture frames. I set the blade height on my table saw and then began to rip the boards down into 1.5 inch sections, which is the thickness that I was going for my frames. As this was scrap wood, I wasn't too concerned with making the most efficient cuts, material wise, so I cut all of my pieces to the same length and then I cut them down to a smaller size that I needed afterwards. After getting all the boards to size, I removed any that might have defects that would keep the frame from having straight edges. These boards can be used later for other projects down the road. I set the fence so I can cut the boards down to the width that I need that is acceptable for the frames I'm making. Because I'm making a mitered picture frame, I draw 45-degree lines onto my piece to guide my cuts so that the corners will match up when I glue them together in the end. The way I got my frame dimensions is I took the poster dimensions, subtracted 1/2 inch from both length and width, and then I proceeded to add 2 times the frame width to both dimensions. While I'm using a table saw, it's not necessary. You could use a handsaw or a bandsaw or even a miter saw, anything to actually cut the wood. Even without access to power tools like a bandsaw or table saw, you can still complete this project for relatively cheaply. With only a saw, chisel, and maybe a plane, you can make a nice looking frame out of some scrap wood that you find. I wanted to create a recess so that the acrylic and poster would sit flush inside of the frame. To do this, I took my blade height down to about half of the wood thickness, and then I began to run the pieces over the blade to create a pocket. I do this at several different distances to create the actual recess that's 1/4 inch in from the edge. This process can be time consuming and not entirely necessary depending on how you want to construct your frame. I did mine in about 4 passes per piece, but I could have probably gotten away with fewer. And of course, you can do them all in one pass with a dado stack. After I cut the recesses, it's time to start cutting the miters. These are the angles that will meet up at the corner to actually construct the frame. To do so, I mark each corner with a pencil, and then I bring out my miter sled, cock it to a 45-degree angle, and then use that line that I've then drawn as a guideline on where to cut. It can sometimes be difficult to get an accurate cut when working off of just a pencil line. What I tend to do is I tend to make shallower cuts and then creep up on my actual line to make sure that I get a nice clean cut exactly where I want. Once all the cuts are finished, it's time to glue it up. I've covered my table saw with a mat to make sure that it doesn't get any wood glue on it, as I'm currently using it as a workbench for filming. I only have 2 corner clamps right now, so rather than clamping 2 sections to a single piece, I opted to make 2 separate pieces. That way I have a little bit more play when I'm actually constructing the final frame. When gluing things together, it's important to get a good spread of wood glue across the entire surface, as it will increase the strength of the bond. Further, compression will also help the strength of the bond, especially if this is a member that will take pressure. I picked up some acrylic from the hardware store, and this is going to be used in lieu of glass, as my table saw with carbide blade can actually cut it fairly well. This is going to be made to the exact dimensions of the poster, as it's going to sit in the recess and protect the poster from the elements. When cutting acrylic, it's important to remember that it can actually throw plastic both back and forward, so you need to take precautions to wear longer sleeves so that you don't get injured by the actual cutting of the acrylic. While I only show the process of making one of these frames, I'm actually making quite a few. That's why I'm cutting multiple pieces of acrylic. I cut out some cardboard that I found lying around as a backer for the poster. And for the hanger, I found a set of them for a few dollars at a hardware store. I measured to get it mostly centered. Of course, there can be some small adjustments when you're actually hanging it. However, you do want to get it mostly centered so that it actually hangs correctly. At the time, I couldn't find my hammer, so I used my smithing hammer instead to drive the nails. I wouldn't suggest this. It was rather uncomfortable to work with such a large hammer in such a small space. Depending on the thickness of the boards that you acquire, you don't necessarily have to use nails. In fact, you could use screws. However, just remember that these tend to be fairly weathered boards, and as such, you should take some care to pre-drill to make sure that it doesn't split if you are using screws. Something I didn't take footage of is there should be some tabs that hold the backer, poster, and acrylic in. This is very useful, and they can be simple pieces of metal. And there you go. That is one of the final picture frames. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and you'll come back sometime soon.